I'm Joe Quinn, and this is the SOT Report. Today I'm speaking to Paul Craig Roberts. Paul is a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan administration, where he earned the title Father of Reaganomics. He has also been an associate editor and columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He was Businessweek's first outside columnist for 16 years and numbered among the top 10 journalists in the United States. He was the first occupant of the William E. Simon Chair for Political Economy at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University and a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He was also inducted into the French Legion of Honour in 1987, so I have no doubt that President Sarkozy would be very interested in this particular report. So Paul, welcome to the SOT Report.
Thank you. Glad to be with you, Joe.
Before we get into more current affairs, I think people will be interested in knowing how you went from a high-level US government official to a renegade truth-teller, if it's okay to call you that. And given the extent of the corruption in the US government over recent years, why have so few other government officials followed suit?
Well, Joe, I think the reason so many people who have served in government keep their peace is because it's lucrative economically to not tell the truth. Because if you tell too much truth, it disturbs the powerful vested interests that can create lucrative remunerations. What I would have to say is I've always been a truth teller. I told the truth when I was in the government. I think that Ronald Reagan gets a bad rap. Reagan brought in the Republican establishment to avoid having them oppose his election. Of course, he also had the neoconservatives in the government, but it was not a neoconservative government. And the neoconservatives were in because Reagan wanted people who would back his strong stance against the Soviets because he wanted to bring the Cold War to an end, and he thought he couldn't bring it to an end if the Soviets were still having successes, and so they needed to be resolutely opposed. And at the time, of course, none of us were aware of the hegemonic ideology of the neoconservatives or their bloodthirsty nature. And when they did misbehave, the Iran-Contra affair and those operations, Reagan fired them.
And these are the same neocons that were behind Bush and the Iraq War and the war on terrorism?
The same ones, yeah. Richard Perle, Wolfowitz, the same ones who completely dominated the Bush administration and are still very influential in the Obama administration.
So you could, to some extent, still tell the truth back then?
Yes, you could do it at the time. And I think I survived as a Businessweek columnist for such a long time because I also told the truth about the George Herbert Walker Bush administration and was not part of the sycophants. And so the editor could defend my continuation in that role because he said that I wrote the most stringent critiques of the Republicans that were available. But, of course, it made the Republicans very angry, and they were always trying to dislodge me from the Simon Chair at CSIS, or, they carry on a constant campaign if you don't simply be a sycophant or a propagandist for them. They expect people who have been in these positions, such as I had, to always be trimming your sails according to how they want the wind to blow. And you spend your career covering for them, and they make it profitable. Fortunately, there were still at the time people who were determined that truth got out, and so I had other supporters. I think these people are drying up, and the kind of ability I had to maintain an independent voice has probably disappeared. I just don't see any support for it now. And the same with the media. With the Clinton administration, they permitted the concentration of the American media into a very few hands. So what had been a diverse independent media became concentrated in a few corporate hands, and it essentially today serves as a propaganda ministry for the government. And so, a person like myself who routinely published in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I mean, even after I was no longer, serving as an official journalist, today I couldn't get anything published in any of those newspapers. There's no independent media in the United States except some internet sites. So the American media is a propaganda ministry. One of the greatest indications of this on last Tuesday, and this will lead us perhaps into some of the economic discussion. Last Tuesday, the Russians and the Chinese announced that they were no longer going to conduct their trade in dollars, that their bilateral trade now will be in their own currencies. I've seen no report of this in the United States media. I've seen nothing on Bloomberg. I've seen nothing on CNN or Washington Post or the New York Times. It's almost like it's just unacknowledged. And yet this is a big development. But, you would think something like this is a big development because the two countries said they were doing this not as an assault on the United States, but to protect themselves from dollar risk. So here's China and Russia saying they see there's too much risk in the dollar to use it as a trade medium. Well, this should be big news. It should be, but it's suppressed.
Did that have an effect on the value of the dollar?
As far as I can tell, no one knows. I mean, the dollar's gone up, at least with regard to the euro and the pound.
Well, in last week's report, I noted that the way the economic terminology is phrased and the way the banking system is structured appears to be deliberately so in order to prevent ordinary people from understanding what is really going on. And I tried to outline the truth behind the recent Irish banking collapse and the 90 billion or more loan from the IMF and the European Central Bank. Have you been following that?
Yes, Joe, I saw your report, and I thought you gave an accurate account. In fact, the same thing is happening everywhere. It's happening in Greece, in France. It'll be in Portugal and Spain. It's happening here too. Now, not in every case do you have the IMF involved, but what is happening in every case is the people, the citizens, or the subjects, as they may be, are being forced to pay for bailouts of debt that is essentially in the end owed to Wall Street and the City of London. You see, the IMF has always been a tool of American financial hegemony, and the United States has been trying to use the European Central Bank in the same way. So what they do, at first the government bails out the banks, its own country's banks. They're in trouble. Now, of course, that means the taxpayers are bailing them out. And then that proves to be an insufficient amount, and the government can't do any more. And so to finish the bailout or continue it, they have to bring in the European Central Bank or the IMF. Or in the United States, it's the Federal Reserve that's printing money to purchase the government's debt and prints money to purchase the bad financial instruments of the banks. So when the IMF comes in, then these austerity policies are imposed on the population on top of the already implied tax burden of the government's attempt to bail out. And then people are squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And you can see this in France. They want to extend the retirement age. That's a way of cutting the pensions you see that people have earned there in England. You see the protest against the rise in tuition fees. In the United States, the plan is the same. They are going to make Social Security recipients pay for the deficit, which is caused by the war and the bank bailouts, by extending the retirement age, reducing the benefits. Recently, the Republicans voted down any further extension of unemployment benefits. So they force ordinary people to pay for bailing out Wall Street. In the end, it's Wall Street that's being bailed out and the City of London. And this is true also, for the French or the Irish, because in the end, what the IMF and the United States want to be sure is that the American banks get paid.
Well, one question that I hear asked a lot is, where did all the money go? If people are being asked to bail out the banks with their taxes, then someone is receiving that money. Someone is getting rich while the people are being impoverished.
It's not that the money is, the balance sheets, if they were correctly valued, then a lot of these banks apparently would be insolvent. And so what they're doing, they're trying to create money to stick into the bank's balance sheets that prevents the insolvency. So here in the United States, what the Federal Reserve does, it simply buys the bad assets and puts it on its books. And so it's not that the money has been lost or stolen so much as they're trying to prevent it from being lost by squeezing it out of the people and putting it on the bank's balance sheets. That's essentially the way I understand it. Now, there's another thing we can add to your account of the Irish situation, which, as I said, is the same as happening essentially everywhere. This also serves the United States government's effort to protect the dollar from falling. Because you see, when the Fed announces that essentially it's going to monetize the U.S. budget deficit, which is huge, then it tells the whole world, well, look, the supply of new dollars is horrendous. It's going to be horrendous, and the value can't possibly be what it is today. And so the dollar starts falling. So then we have a crisis in Greece. See. And we create a euro scare, and so everybody runs to the dollar goes back up. And then it starts to fall again. So now we got Ireland, and the dollar goes back up. And they'll work their way through Spain and Portugal and Italy and France. Do you see what I'm saying? This is another part of the European financial crisis because it serves the United States government's effort to protect the dollar from the money creation of the Federal Reserve. So that's another aspect of it. You see, it's part of the hegemonic financial dominance of the Americans over the world. And it's probably the reason the Chinese and the Russians have said, we're not playing this game anymore. It's an American tool for American financial hegemony.
Well, it's certainly not looking good for people in the US or Europe, because the end result of these bailouts, as you've said, appears to be a major reduction in ordinary people's standard of living.
I don't know if Europeans appreciate it, but as far as I can tell, there are no independent governments in Europe. They're all American puppet states. And not a single one of those governments serves the interests of their people. They serve American interests. France used to be different until they got Sarkozy. He's just another tool of American hegemony.
And in your opinion, Paul, what is the mechanism by which that control is exerted over foreign leaders and governments?
Oh, it's always been that way, ever since the end of World War II. And part of it, we simply buy them. We just give them money. I think it was American money that elected Sarkozy. And you see, so we don't just give them money, but we use our financial hegemony to the dollar being the reserve currency, the IMF and the World Bank being tools of American imperialism. These allow the dominance of the Americans, plus all the implicit threats to exclude people from the banking system, from the trading system. It grew up naturally during the Cold War because Europe needed the Americans to protect. We organized them with NATO, with all sorts of. Look, there's still American bases in Germany. World War II ended 65 years ago. It's an empire, and the constituent parts of empires are generally subservient. Something big has to happen to break it up. It's not clear what that would be, other than the collapse of the dollar as reserve currency. If the Americans can't keep this Potemkin economy going with money creation, then people will simply abandon the dollar, and that'll be the end of the American empire, because that's, in the end, what it rests on. And we see these beginnings already happening. The Chinese and the Brazilians no longer use the dollar. When they're bilateral trade, the Chinese and the Russians are abandoning it. We've seen other efforts, if it were to penetrate into OPEC, such that oil is no longer priced in dollars. This would have another big psychological effect. So an empire has many ways to effect its will.
Indeed, it's starting to look more and more like a dictatorship in the US in everything but name, with a dictator that simply changes every 4 or 8 years.
But you see, it doesn't matter because it's institutionalized now in the new asserted powers of the executive branch. And so whereas the figurehead turns over, the agencies don't. The CIA, the FBI, the Transportation Security Administration, the Homeland Security, the bureaucracies there have their procedures. They're institutionalized. And so regardless of who's in the White House or who's even the head of the agency, procedures are now institutionalized. They are, in effect, law. Do you see what I'm saying? From use. And I don't think there's any enabling legislation from Congress creating the body scanners. You see, the body scanners came, Joe, from the underwear bomber. And I think it was all arranged so that Michael Chertoff, who represents the manufacturers of body scanners, would be able to have enough scare, enough fear factor to get the machines purchased and in place. So he's been lobbying to have these machines put in because he represents the manufacturers. So how do you get that kind of intrusion imposed?